Hello and most welcome to 1125. And today, for once, I'm going to make the proposition very, very simple. I would look at Heidegger's relation to space. And my proposal is that Zuhanden is closer to the world, which is maybe not that advanced, but it's also paradoxical in nature. And Vorhanden is stirring away from nature and paradox. It's a bit more like only one take on the Necker cube, and it's essentially non-paradoxical. And I will also say that one could be more pre-reflective before the collapse, I will also suggest. That is, being in the superposition. The second, the Vorhanden, is reflective, and it's after the collapse. Another comparison that could be made here is that the pre-reflective corresponds to some degree, not wholly, but to the Bohmian concept of implicitness. And of course, then the second one do equal, to a great extent, explicitness. And Heidegger wants to show that they both are important. When I read Heidegger the first time, biased as I was, I made the conclusion that Vorhanden was something lesser. It is just less common, but it's not lesser as such. It's a different take on reality. And as you might remember from my wrong numbered 1124, the previous one, both are present in the Klein bottle. Both the pre-reflective and the reflective. The signifying and the signified. The signifying could be seen as sort of a Zuhanden, that you do something, in a gerund way, I do signify something. By doing that, almost like pointing, it's an activity. And it ends up in the Vorhanden, the signified. So this is my thesis, and I'm going to, for this thesis, use 3 different papers. There's an article where Heidegger is compared to Graham Priest, and as you know, Graham Priest is the inventor of the consistent logic, a professor from Australia, who says that it was Heidegger actually who inspired him to the paraconsistent logic, which is in itself very interesting, because there are some indications that Heidegger himself did understand paraconsistent logic, but not explicitly. So he wasn't able to transfer it to us other readers of Heidegger, but it's still present both in his text and within Heidegger himself. I claim that that is the most usual thing. For the absolute majority of people, the understanding of paraconsistent logic, the understanding of this is implicitly already present. But usually when we start to talk, argument, and to some extent reflect, we usually take the stance that one is excluded, that Vorhanden is the thing that goes. That is mighty interesting. I didn't think about that, but I realized most people are already somewhere in the paradoxical world of the reality. This is an article by Paul Austin Murphy, and it's titled Graham Priest and Martin Heidegger on Nothing. I really like the photo of Graham Priest here, he looked like a rock star. And I think that is very fitting for a proponent of Heidegger today. Another click here for when I stand here. Thanks. Perhaps the most important way in which Graham Priest has been influenced by Martin Heidegger is the latter's view on Western logic itself. Heidegger once wrote, cite, "If the power of intellect in the field of inquiry into the nothing and into being is thus shattered, then the destiny of the reign of logic in philosophy is thereby decided. The idea of logic itself disintegrates in the turbulence of a more original questioning." And this is very similar to Heraclitus. I do get standing here, the beforeness. One can see how all that poetical stuff can lead to dialetheism, which after all embraces contradictions. So whereas Heidegger appeared to hold up his hand in despair at Western philosophy, or simply reject Western philosophy in toto, Priest offers us his dialephism as a solution to the problems which Heidegger has just articulated in the passage above. And more importantly, since Heidegger deconstructed or destructed Western logic, then that, almost by definition, must inevitably lead to the deconstruction of Western philosophy as a whole. At least that would be the case if one saw Western philosophy as a Platonic form. Thus Heidegger's route to his destruction of philosophy was through the questioning of logic. Heidegger, like Priest, can also be said to have been misled, this is in quotation, by the word nothing, which he turned into his the nothing, das Nichts. Maybe Carnap was right about this, and so possibly Wittgenstein, that is, being philosophically perplexed by the use of the word nothing lead to language going on holiday. This is a quote from Wittgenstein. So it's also odd that Priest seemed to completely reject or possibly ignore everything that was said by Wittgenstein and other philosophers about these and similar subjects. And here comes to the pertinent question. Why do we name or refer to nothing? There's nothing to hold on to, yet psychologically speaking, thoughts about nothing can fill some people with dread, as Heidegger, through Priest, will later stress. There is something psychologically or emotionally both propelling and appalling about it. And that's why existentialists and other philosophers, with a taste for the dramatic and poetic, found the subject of nothing, or at least nothingness, such a rich philosophical ground to mine. Priest says that everything can be absence. That may be an assumption that everything once existed and then became absent. Of course, there can be something followed by nothing, just as some argue that there might have been nothing followed by something. So how can all things be absent if there never were things in the first place? There is an answer to this. That is, we can have all things and then we can have nothing. Say, if God decided to destroy all things. However, I don't believe that Priest had such a scenario in mind, because after all he says, quote, philosophers often wonder why there is something rather than nothing. And indeed, Wittgenstein once wrote, not how the world is mystical, but that it is. In other words, once there were nothing and then there was something. Priest goes one step further. Heidegger indeed claimed that one can have a direct phenomenological experience of nothing. So we need to know what Heidegger meant by our having a direct phenomenological experience of nothing. He writes further, one can have a direct phenomenological acquaintance with non-existent objects, end of quote. One can have a direct phenomenological acquaintance with something, and that something is taken to be a non-existent object. That is what we can have a phenomenological experience of. Say Sherlock Holmes, even though he's not a real person, however, we still have acquaintance with some things. The actor who plays Holmes, our mental images of Holmes, the paintings of Holmes, etc. The main point of Priest's reference to our phenomenological acquaintance with non-existent objects is to state this conclusion. Nothing is a non-existent object which we have direct phenomenological acquaintance with. Following on from all that, the very idea of nothing or nothingness is hard, or possibly even impossible, to conceive or imagine. This means that, at least for myself, it fails David Chalmers' conceivability argument. He says, 1, X is conceivable, 2, whatever is conceivable is possible, therefore X is possible. However, what if that which is conceived of isn't actually conceived of in the first place? What if it's only the case that words about the conceived of are simply uttered? And that's a big difference. Now we are down to the explicitness, not the implicitness. The explicit is not what we have experience of. It is the reflection of the experience. In any case, the important point with this is that we can distinguish conceivability from imaginability. That is, even if we can't construct mental images, etc., of nothing or nothingness, perhaps we can still conceive of nothing or nothingness. I, for one, can't even conceive of nothing, so this isn't similar to someone conceiving a million-sided object. Can other people conceive of nothing? Do they even have intuitions about nothing or about the notion of nothingness? Heidegger's words. Does such an attachment, in which man is brought before the nothing itself, occur in human existence? This can and does occur, although rarely and only for a moment, in the fundamental mode of anxiety, angst, end of quote. Here Heidegger is more likely to have meant the absence of a specific object, or the absence of specific objects. After all, how can man be brought before the nothing itself? In Priest's sense of nothing, Priest is talking about the absence of all objects, not the absence of some objects or one object. For example, Heidegger's "the nothing" may be what happens when someone visits an old building and discovers that it's no longer there. Nonetheless, the visitor is still there, and so is the surrounding landscape. Priest and Heidegger are absolutely correct. Nothingness does have psychological resonances. It's just that we can't tie those resonances to anything ontological. To connect these psychological or phenomenological facts or experiences to an ontology is a kind of psychologism in the Fregean sense. Fregean sense means indirect way of doing it, by a symbol or a sign. Nonetheless, Priest doesn't always accept Heidegger's views on nothing, though he does often mention them. Thus, Priest qualifies himself when he states the following: one does not have to share Heidegger's Gothic pessimism to agree that one can have a phenomenological experience of nothing. All you can have to do is think about it. Despite these qualifications, Priest does then say that here, Heidegger got it exactly right. Let's take the Heidegger quote once again, and the additional words, anxiety reveals the nothing. What does that mean? And even though anxiety is a real psychological phenomenon, how many anxious people have nothing revealed to them? Priest continues in a note on the theme of absence. He writes, philosophers often wonder why there is something rather than nothing. However, even if there were nothing, even if everything would be entirely absent, there would be something, namely nothing. Ontological dependence or grounding. Priest also seemed to accept Heidegger on grounding, or the so-called ontological dependency. Heidegger wrote, if the nothing itself is to be questioned, as we have been questioning it, then it must be given beforehand. We must be able to encounter it. End of quote. The next one is from Priest. The nothing is the complete negation of the totality of beings. End of quote. As just has been said, Priest often mentioned Heidegger and Hegel, and it was originally Hegel who argued that nothingness was the ground of reality. Priest says that every object depends for being what it is on nothingness, and that in particular distancing itself from nothingness, that existence is distancing itself from nothingness. That simply raises the same question: what exactly do these statements mean? Put simply, Priest argues that all objects are grounded in nothing. Indeed, everything must also be grounded in nothing. Priest doesn't like the expression or term grounding that much. Instead, he believes that ontological dependence is much better, like Heidegger. So what is this about? If X is ontologically dependent on Y, then Y must also ground X. I think that's a fair assumption by the author of the article. In any case, Priest rightly says that some things depend for being what they are on other things, end of quote. Yet it's whether or not some things depend for being what they are on nothing that's relevant here. Well, one could say that Graham Priest ontologically depends on the zygote of his parents. But does Graham Priest depend on nothing as well? Well, let's have another look at Priest's own example. He says, the shadow of a tree depends for being what it is on the tree itself. The shadow of the tree depends on the tree in a way that the tree doesn't depend on the shadow. Interesting. The strange thing here is that the shadow is a more ontologically robust thing and even more physical than Priest's nothing. Shadows, after all, are causally related to the physical thing which causes them. Is nothing causally related to physical things? Indeed, even though the shadow of a tree is an epiphenomenon, it is still dependent on physical things. Here again, Priest borrows from Heidegger. This time it's Priest's notion of distancing, which are Heideggerian. Thus, quote, in the clear night of nothing of anxiety, the original openness of beings as such arises, that they are beings and not nothing, end of quote. What is Priest claiming when he says that to be a being is to distance it from nothingness? Priest then goes on to say that a being couldn't be a being unless it was not nothingness. Thus, quote, so to be in objects depends on nothingness as something that the being distances and distinguishes itself from. Is this like the claim that Paul Murphy couldn't be Paul Murphy unless he had distanced himself and distinguished himself from cabbages or protons? Sure, here we have a material object, a human being, distancing and distinguishing himself from other material objects, like cabbages, not from nothingness. Nonetheless, can any being truly distinguish and distance itself from such a strange thing as nothingness? And if he, she could, what does that actually mean? Is this a psychological or an ontological distancing and distinguishing? One can accept that persons can verbally or psychologically distinguish and distance themselves from anything, even from nothing. Though ontologically, how is that distancing and distinguishing actually brought about? Listen to Priest here. To say what something is, you have to say what it stands outside. What's it's different from? This is just an application of this to the notion of being an object. End of quote. Could be hard to make sense of this if we need to say what X stands outside of, then it stands outside everything that isn't itself. Thus, must we name literally everything that's not X or which is outside X? Just a few of these things. It's true that in common parlance we define many things by what they're not. But this is a linguistic and psychological phenomenon, not an ontological phenomenon. For example, we can say that Prime Minister Boris Johnson stands outside the planet Mercury, and all fish and chip shops. That is certainly true, but what ontological or even psychological relevance does that have? The same is true of priests different from. Boris Johnson is different from an iron gate or a shopping bag. More fundamentally, he is different from all that's not Boris Johnson. Of course, in a less ridiculous way, we can say that Boris is different from a good or a bad man. But here again, where is the ontology in all this? All we have are linguistic and psychological different froms. Sure, there are ontological differences between Boris and iron gates. There are ethical differences between Boris and other human beings as well. However, which differences from, if any, are fundamental or ontologically relevant? Having said that, all the above may be beside the point because Priest's main thesis is that Boris Johnson stands outside and is different from nothing or nothingness. The other cases just cited may therefore be seen as being less fundamental by Priest. Priest then moves to his notion metaphor of distancing. Distancing is a concept from Heidegger. He says that to be an object, a thing must be ontologically dependent on not being. And what's more, its nature, it's constituted by standing outside nothingness, as it were. End of quote. The last clause, as it were, is certainly apt here, because it's hard to fathom what standing outside nothingness is. This is like being drowned in metaphor. Heidegger writes, nothing is neither an object, not any being at all. Nothing thus comes forward neither for itself, non-text to being, to which it would, as it were, adhere stick. Priest then explains himself in yet more Heideggerian terms. He says, that's an interesting metaphor for human existence. Nothing makes possible the openness of beings as such. This may refer to Heidegger's idea that human beings posits themselves against nothingness, or the possibility of their own non-being. This seems to be a poetic expression of human beings exerting their contingent, very important, contingent existence and putting their finger up to it. That is, we human beings or persons are open to nothingness and even open to death. Another word from Heidegger's summing. Priest has a rather odd position on summing. Everything is the sum of all things. Nothingness is the sum of no thing, no objects. End of quote. How can nothingness be a sum of no things, no objects? Is this similar to saying that no apples can be summed to with no oranges? Abstract objects can be summed, as in set theory or mathematics, but is nothing an abstract object? It certainly bears little relationship to sets, proposition, numbers, etc. In addition, although nothing is seen as an object, as well as not being an object, Priest also says that everything is not an object. Yet prima facie, it seems that everything is a better candidate for being an object than nothing is. To get back to the passage above, what is it to be the sum of every object? Is this an exercise in counting, collecting, joining, or even of fusing? This gets a bit more problematic when it comes to nothing. That is, what is the sum of no things? Priest even uses the word fuse together no things, end of quote. How does that fusion actually occur? Surely in the order for any x to fuse with any y or anything, it firstly needs to be separated from y. Does this apply to Priest's no things too? And how does this summing actually work? Is it an action, an event, a process, or a condition? In any case, Priest argues that when one has the sum of no things, we get nothingness. Is this equivalent to saying the following: if we add 0 to 0, we get 0? I think that sort of establish a certain take that needs to be repeated, and that is the necessity of the Klein bottle. Without that specific, wondrous and marvelous understanding, we can end up in problems like the author of this article, because he got stranded in different divisions that I would say hinder his understanding of Heidegger. And the nothingness is not understood to be the founding father of what is. How can I claim that? Well, look at it this way. I divided things in this simplification of the proposal for the lecture in Zuhanden, and I put the Klein bottle here, and I call that paradox. I put Vorhanden under, I put 1, this is, you can't depict one Necker cube, and I put 1 here just like this, non-paradoxical. Why is that? Well, without all corners of the Necker cube, how can you have a Necker cube? It is impossible. And yet the different sides of the Necker cube, and also an object like a thermos or a pen or a cup, they are all paradoxical, because the different sides of them, they don't add up to one object. This is the nature of Vorhanden. It could, when used as the only modus or Stimmung, lead us to the conclusion that reality is not real, that there is no reality to the things, because one side of the Necker cube actually obliterates the other side. Can you see that? You can't have both, but you can make explicit Vorhanden of both. For instance, I can see the Necker cube 1, you can see Necker cube 2. Are these possible to add together? No, they're not. They will not make up a whole Necker cube. And that goes to show that contradiction is at the very bottom of reality. And it's only if you get stranded, as Austin did here in the Vorhanden. It was very obvious from the start. I picked Austin's article completely by chance. I wanted to have an article I didn't know anything about, just that it was written by somebody who was quite smart. That was all I demanded. But my assumption would be that he were to be stranded in Forehanden. I don't know how much the chance is, but at least 500 requests came when I Googled, and I didn't pick the first one. I went down the list in articles. And this is what I mean with the Klein bottle being essential. Otherwise, you will be in Forehanden, and then you will not see that reality itself, not only the Necker cube, although the Necker cube is a marvelous helping tool. It's a new invention. It's a discovery made in the late 19th century. It does, when you look at it, change in front of your eyes from one material thing to another. And those two material things are contradictory. Can you see how helpful a tool it is? And what Heidegger means, and I would say also priest, although he doesn't express it in the way I would with the Klein bottle, is that that is the nature of reality. And getting stuck here in only Forehanden, only in the reflective after the collapse. Because if I tell Kalle here, or Henrik, who's probably listening, about the one Necker cube I see here, I will exclude the other ones. It could also lead to that the other people won't see the other Necker cube, which has been proven. You can influence other to shut out the other model. This is an example how reality works. We can get tricked, and also I can get tricked in my endeavor to understand Heidegger, Heraclitus, and quantum physics. Therefore, it was a little bit of medication for me to read an article taking the stance of Forehanden, which I would say must be the very most common thing of seeing things. Forehanden, as you see, Kalle, also lead to something other we pointed out before. And what is that? Just take a guess. I will write the first.
Monosemism.
Yes. I would say it's not so hard to see that in an object, saying it's only one meaning or one way I see it, transferring that, making it explicit to you others who are listening or watching. It's a bit of monosemism. I do something explicit, how I saw it now, and then I reflect upon it, and I also communicate it. And it's a bit after the collapse. What is with monosemism, it is not accepting the paradox, because the paradox is healing. And this is the odd thing. This is the toughest thing to understand, and this is why I should have had a Klein bottle here. But it's also healing the possibility of having just one meaning, oddly enough. Whereas if you get stuck in the monosemism, you cannot even have the one meaning, the one take of the Necker cube. This is Rosen's very tough point. And it's a comfort. The odd article I just picked among 500 or 600 went to this. So this is very easy, and it's the most common way. And since you're surrounded by people whose proprioception does that thing, sometimes in opposing directions. Yes, it could be one that claims one of the Necker cube or two, and as well as you well know, Kalle, in translation of Greek words, some group claims one meaning and other claims another, and there is a discourse and argumentation. This is not the point here. This is, of course, that's how it is. The important thing is, once you take in the paradox, you can both be specific about the meaning, and you can at the same time be general. And this is what the author of the article would have needed. It's a sort of a bit exaggerated healing thing. So now let me get into example on more of this side, taking in both. And this is another article by Stephen M Rosen, which I think we've gone through one time before.
Is it the body as a paradox, or is it?
No, let's see here. It's. Give me a sec. I have it here.
Yes, the previous paper by Rosen that you went through was wholeness as the body of paradox from 97. Wholeness as the body of paradox, but this one is.
This is, I think, could be 500 or 600 lectures ago. It was one weekend we had, and it was a marvelous weather. We went for walks and everything. And I remember Henrik brought some sort of actually an object of some sort that you can use to make a fire. I'm afraid that never happened. This is a small article called Dimensions of Apeiron, and this is actually excerpts from apeiron. I would like to have the whole book. And this is a way of trying to show this with other words. Topological Phenomenology of Space, Time and Individuation. And here the most important word is individuation. It's a bit like monosemic. If you really, in a Klein bottle situation, your discussion, a Greek word for instance, and you point your finger and you want to have one meaning in that particular circumstance, you can have that. But constantly claiming monosemism will rid you to a certain degree of that opportunity to put your foot down, to be decisive, to be conclusive. And this has to do with the voice of the friend. It has to do that convergent and divergent, as Heraclitus says, are stemming from one and the same thing. And so are these. These two are coming from something more originary, something we cannot reflect upon directly, but we still can make fantastic use of it. There is a danger, although I think I'm really happy about this, there is also an inherent danger here to look after, and this is that we divide the world into these two bits and says, now we have it, now we have everything. No, it's more of complementary. So they need to contradict each other, and they need to be what they are. They should not be nullified, as Rodolphe Gachet warns us from. Should not be nullified. Look out for that. Easy done, and it will be done back and forth. But the less you do it, the more of the, and I really like this term of Stephen M Rosen, he should be congratulated for it. It is so good. I'm going to do it differently this time. Wholeness. All comes from the deciding, distinctive, making whole. The whole in the Klein bottle, which is also that totality. And there is a hint. This, I think it's a good hint. The space of the Platonic idea of the receptacle, it is wholeless. It is also seamless. It's a perfect, homogeneous, non-deviating, and actually lacking properties of a nothingness. In the apeiron, which I will just start with, it is claimed that in the angst that I mentioned earlier, the anxiety, we fear the apeiron. I felt that fear, and it's obvious that the pre-Socratic, like Parmenides, Xenophanes, and others feared it as well. This is the horror vacui. But what it shows, that the vacui is quite different from what we think. Quite different. And those that I will have two groups. 99% of the population would say go away from the vacuum. And then we have this 1%. I'm happy to have stumbled upon him as a Swedish yoga teacher and also some interpreters of Heraclitus. His name is Bet Yoga Jonsson, something like this. Really odd name. He was the one who said, embrace that nothingness or the horror vacuum. Go into the horrible place. This is also partly the view of Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus. I'd say those people are actually also wrong. So it's not go to the vacuum and it's not steer away from it. Because the vacuum is different. By predicting the vacuum to be vacuum, then you're blocked off already. If for some reason I have some emotions with me who are not completely sane, I could actually go to the horror vacuum for like hurting reasons. You see people who eat too much, that's a way of hurting yourself, drink too much, endeavor in gaming and such things. Those things can happen. And I think that was the case in this Bet Yoga Jonsson and other negative, I say negative interpreters of Heraclitus / Heidegger, like definitely Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus. I don't criticize the idea of going to the negative. I don't even criticize the idea of self-hurt. Well, go ahead, be masochist. It's okay. This is not a moral lecture. But it's wrong. It's wrong because the vacuum is not what we think. We have an anxiety about something, but that thing is not what we think. It is completely different. And although Parmenides and Plato saw it as the boundless, it has the opposite characters. It has the character of boundedness. Because it's only in the Klein bottle you can have boundedness. It's only in the Klein bottle you can have inner and outer. This is the tougher lesson to learn from the Klein bottle. It's only that one that allows for distinction, borders, and truths to be had. I would say that might be one of the most gigantic surprises in humankind. I'll read a little bit to start with. We'll carry on with that in the following lectures. He writes a very, very good introduction to his own book here in this excerpt. This book explores the evolution of space and time from the apeiron, the spaceless, timeless chaos of primordial nature. The selections to follow highlight the various manifestations of apeiron on the contemporary scene. In quantum mechanics, we see intimations of apeiron in the curious phenomena of quantized action and minuscule strings found in subatomic space. Apeiron is seen at play in the cosmological oddity of the black hole, definitely, in the parents of modern technology, and in the addictive quality of postmodern culture at large. In all cases, we harbor the fear that this primal force will negate human reason and individuality. Yes, indeed. But the upsurgence of apeiron is in fact an opportunity to take advance the process of individuation. An opportunity to advance the process of individuation. Apeiron embodies the ambiguity at our core that must be brought to light and consciously proceed if we were to attain fulfillment as human beings. Only by setting aside all categorical isms like dualism, reductionism, idealism, or why not non-dualism, and consciously hold in the paradox of apeiron, can the whole person gain concrete realization. The contemporary crisis, I think that's a paragraph that lends itself as an easy start. Change itself changes. Over the last 150 years, it has assumed a qualitatively new, more emphatic form. The continuous orders of change that were characteristic of earlier times have given way to a thoroughgoing discontinuity, and this has affected virtually every sector of modern life: popular culture, art, literature, science, mathematics, the media. The gradual evolution of our social, political, and economic institutions has been disrupted by the onset of multiple crises that have thrown many of these systems into disarray. There has been a disintegration of family and church, how true. The ethnic conflicts that rage around the world today reflect a destabilization of national identity. We have seen an alarming growth in international banditry and terrorism. World markets have reached new levels of erratic fluctuation. Nuclear weapons and waste are proliferating out of control. Thus, it has gone. As a consequence of all this, fragmentation is now widespread, not only throughout society, but also in each individual. This is actually a cite from David Bohm, and how true. Alberto Melucci observed accordingly that, given the surging flux of events and relations, the points of reference used by individuals and groups in the past to plot their life courses are disappearing. Taken collectively, these cultural discontinuities constitute the crisis of postmodernity. Just what happened to precipitate the dilemma? Was it a particular event? Was it a set of events occurring in a certain place at a certain time that led us to this pass? I suggest that what happened was a transformation of our experience of space-time themselves. At bottom, it is the sense of space and time that began to be fragmented in the middle of the 19th century. The introduction of non-Euclidean geometry, the advent of Impressionist art, the Einsteinian revolution in physics, all bear witness to the impending breakup of classical space. Along with this, from Melucci, our experience of time undergoes increasing fragmentation. Linear times yields to an experience of transitions without development, to a movement between disconnected points, a sequence of fleeting movements. It's Melucci with two C's. The all sense of smoothly passing from the past to present to future becomes a spasmodic leaping ahead into a boundless array of divergent possibilities. In short, the contemporary experience of space and time entails the shock of discontinuity. And here is a quote from John Burgess and John Moore, actually writing about the advent of photography. The characterization of the shocking effects of photography that were especially evident when the medium was first conceived in 1839. Few people speak about this, but at the advent of photography, it was a complete disaster. It was maybe the biggest thing that ever happened to art. And it disrupted so many thinking about space. It disrupted our sense of who we are, what is aesthetics, and where we're striving to. So although it was a fantastic technological advent, so much used after that, it was also a disaster because it distanced us. Assuming that the mid-19th century unsettlement of classical space and time has in fact contributed to our current state of turmoil in a significant way, how can we better understand it? I suggest that the 19th century watershed betokened the reappearance of an old nemesis. Western culture was forged, how very good, from the struggle of human reason with the irrational forces of nature. To early Greek, science and philosophy, nature is the wild apeiron. This is the Greek word for what is limitless, boundless, or indeterminate. The apeiron is variously interpreted as the unintelligible, the many, the moving, the ugly, the bad, the in-choked flux of opposites or contraries, the principle of disorder or disharmony. In its sheer boundlessness, apeiron defies containment within the ordering context of space and time, and is this the very same apeiron that is tried to be conquered by the Milesian philosophers of natures, the physikos. It's a way of conquering it. It's a way of making the openness to become reflective, to become explicit, to become monosemic or just one take on the Necker cube. That's the tendency. I'm looking for the tendency now here, not so much the words or how they explain it, but the tendency is clear. And by going to the modus or the Stimmung, we can find something a lot in common between the Milesians. Although at a very superficial level they would seem to be in contrast with each other, this more foundational way of looking at them put them into the same direction. Away from the apeiron, conquering the apeiron, telling reflectively what it is. And I would say it is no coincidence at all that this coincides so well with the moving of the consciousness from the body to nowhere, the reflective consciousness of Richard E. Lind. The disappearance of the wholeness of the Odyssey and the Iliad, where we all of a sudden get these objects inserted and then subjects, and then we get predicates on the objects and the subjects, striving to make everything explicit. And it's not only among the philosophers. This is happening en masse in Greek civilization. It doesn't have to be in complicated words. It doesn't have to be the philosopher who says it. It might as well be the salesman or the commoner or the farmer. It was an ongoing trend. And that ongoing trend was actually nurtured by the inheritance from the Babylonians to the Greek, geometry, because that entered into all aspects of Greek life. Farmers had use for it, sailors even more, mariners. Remember that all the Greek city-states were mariners. They were all sailing. Boats were incredibly important. And what is sailing? It is sailing on a surface that is absolutely flat. It invites to the idea that somehow space is separated from you. Why? Because water is absolutely uniform at the first take. Water served directly experientially for the Greek as an experience of something that was homogeneous, that was equal to every level, a sort of canvas where you can put a ship, a man, a woman, or a god like Xenophanes, and compare it to the nothingness. So I think that is a very, very important part, that the Greek societies were thalassic societies. It's very important. And they used advanced geometry in their navigating systems. And I think that enforced, because you had ships all over the place in the Greek cultures. Just as Socrates said, Greeks are like frogs around the pond, always directed to the water, not land-born. And that is an extraordinarily important feature of what later happened, what the step that was taken by the Milesian philosophers of nature. It was in experience, so to speak. Of course, water is not that homogeneous, but it lends itself to that perspective. It's a bit like the mirror. You can get trapped, but it's not necessary. I would say it's no happenstance that at least 2 or 3 of the Milesian philosopher of nature suggested water as the arche, because he has incredible interesting metamorphical properties. It can become ice, hard. Therefore, it lends to the idea that hardness can be everything that is hard. It can be steam, vapor. It can be moist. They notice moist, which is very important. That from somehow air is water. Because in the morning you find moistness. And then you have fog. And then they also saw how water can go from the liquid state to disappear more or less. And therefore it lends itself to explain everything, to make everything explicit. It is dangerous in a way. And it's also something they use to conquer the apeiron, not allowing the apeiron to have any properties. And by defining it so, the horror vacuum become real, because they already defined that everything that is good, everything that has boundaries is on this side. And I would say that's a mistake. Both these things are coming from something greater, more encompassing. And this is why Heraclitus put his foot down, because at once he could do 2 things. He could, thanks to the Milesian philosophers of nature, he could explain his own ideas. He needed the springboard of the Milesians to explain his philosophy. But he can also indirectly warn for the consequences of not listening to Heraclitus and fall directly into the trap. In its sheer boundlessness, apeiron defies containment with the order and context of space and time. You see here, the poor chap who wrote the article, he is in that state. No, I was there myself. I'm not blaming any finger. But I was there. It's natural without having the Klein bottle. Wherever you strive, you are damned, because negating monosemism will also reinforce monosemism. If I say that particular meaning of that particular word is not that meaning, I would reinforce the idea of another meaning, the negation of that. And this is what the Greek did. They negated, so to speak, all they had, all the boundaries, all the clearness, all the knowledge, and said, beyond that, we have no knowing. We have the chaos. Go away from that. So it's from the very stance that the fear comes, and the fear is massive. It fueled their philosophy, I would say. it was fueled by fear. To establish, to make things static, and sometimes they went to such high levels, like Parmenides, to both say that movement was impossible and also nothingness in itself was impossible. It was therefore imperative for them to tame the apeiron, giving the primary impulse that motivated their actions. To paraphrase Protagoras, man must be the measure of all things. What this basically required was the ascendancy of the autonomous individual. More generally stated, from the outset, Western culture has been spurred by the drive toward differentiated being or individuality, toward individuation. Achieving this end essentially has meant containing what at first appeared uncontainable, the boundless apeiron. The proposition I submit here is that apeiron, after being held at bay for over 2,000 years, has now returned with a vengeance. This, I suggest, is the dilemma that underlies postmodernity. The disruption of space and time, and along with it, all of the points of reference used by individuals and groups in the past to plot their life courses, thus seem to point to a total unraveling of centuries of progress in human affairs. All that we have gained seems threatened. All seems on the verge of being lost. Remember the closing of the American mind. It could be said to be closing of the Western mind. This is the fear of losing everything. But appearance can be deceiving. What I propose is that the upsurgence of apeiron, far from being indelibly spelling the demise of human individuality, actually offers us the opportunity to bring it to fruition. Quantum mechanics and apeiron. At the close of the 19th century, a groundbreaking experiment of phenomenon of light was conducted. Max Planck was investigated black body radiation, the emission of electromagnetic energy in a completely absorbent medium, a closed cavity that does not reflect light but soaks it up, then discharges the energy internally. Classical theory faced a perplexing difficulty here. If the traditional analysis was correct, energy should be transmitted in a smooth and continuous fashion. Yet this assumption leads to the peculiar prediction that if a non-reflective body is exposed to intense heat, it should radiate an infinite amount of energy, a result that is clearly not borne out by empirical observation. This is the ultraviolet catastrophe, and let me point extra pressure on that. The ultraviolet catastrophe was an immense catastrophe. It led to depression, suicide, and corruption of thinking. It was the negation of all classical thought, a disaster to say the least. A disaster on the level of the taking out of all the dinosaurs with a big meteorite that stranded in the Gulf of Mexico, but also comparable to Gödel's theorem. They both run havoc into the system. Planck responded to the contradiction by boldly amending the underlying classical assumption. This is really bold. He proposed that light, rather than radiating in a smoothly continuous manner, is transmitted in discrete bundles, the quanta. This introduction of discontinuity into theory now brought a remarkable correspondence with empirical data. The new quantum theory could predict laboratory findings to a high degree of accuracy by adding just one parameter, h. This is the constant of proportionality that relates the energy E of a quantum of radiation to the frequency V of the oscillation that preceded it. E equals hv. The numerical value of h is 6.63 times 10 up to 34 minus. The extremely small value of Planck's constant is consistent with the fact that in familiar world of large-scale happenings, energy does appear to propagate in a smoothly continuous fashion. It is only when we look more closely, examining the microscopic properties of light, that we notice its discontinuous quantized reign. It took a generation for the truly revolutionary implications of quantum mechanics to become clear. Under the lingering influence of classical thinking, it was natural to assume that the discontinuity of energy was not really fundamental. For if the properties of quantum of energy were to be subject to a complete scientific determination, it seemed as if the discontinuity ultimately had to be reducible to continuous expression via an underlying space-time substrate. Yet, by the 1930s, most physicists had arrived at the conclusion that no such reduction is possible. At this point, the majority of researchers felt obliged to accept the idea that Planck's microscopic quantization implies a basic indivisibility of energy that confounds analytic continuity, and in so doing calls into question all classical thinking about space and time, including that of Einstein. Therefore, in light of quantum mechanics, the concept of spatial and temporal continuity are hardly adequate tools for dealing with the microphysical reality. And I would say the quantized light, that made name for quantum physics as such, it started with the light. That light comes in quanta, comes in small packages. It is not continuous. And this is the disaster that run havoc into the intellectual area, because oddly enough, just like the Newtonian classical physics spreading to Voltaire, Rousseau, and also people like Dolbach, and then spread all over humanity, these ideas also spread indirectly, in the way that they said regular space is no longer, but there were no replacement. It was anarchy. After that, anything could be questioned, even your own position, so that the relative stability that lingered on for millennia was dispersed. And that disaster was actually fostered by quantum mechanics. It's an offspring. I can assure you that this is not the conclusion of Stephen M. Rosen. He wants to show us how we can stir away from that ultraviolet disaster, because that ultraviolet disaster hit much harder on the intellectual sciences, on philosophy, on humanizing, on religion, on everything, than it did in physics. Maybe to the scale of 1 to 100, maybe 1 to 1,000. It made everybody feel like now we have nothing to relate to anymore. But this is not the whole picture. There is a savior on the side, and that savior is true directionality. this is true boundaries. These are the true phase of space and time. So it can be interpreted as something horribly horrendous happening to humanity. And sure, this is true. It has pushed us into a direction of war, fiendship, egotism, and inflation and attenuation of all values that were before. All values gets nullified, whether we like it or not, because all of a sudden everything can turn into its opposite. And that will happen in your own thinking. There's no way of sort of warding yourself off from the apeiron. It's not possible. No one can do that. And therefore it was a disaster, an absolute catastrophe. But it's also a good thing, because it pushes us into a new direction where we can find stability that wasn't even possible in the classical vision. And we can find true directionality. And we can find that immensity of having both and still making both things stronger. Being able to be very distinct at the same time as we are absolutely general. We can both be monosemic and we can have the pre-reflective mode still at bay. And we can gather energy from the pre-reflective source, because that's the source of human existence. So to put it very sharply, one could say that the classical physical idea, the thing that we lived in for 2,500 years, was actually a quite sharp limitation of the potentialities for being, the potentiality for the human soul. And it might be that attenuation and the dissolvement of God, the human soul, and our free will started already with the pre-Socratic. Remember Xenophanes. He's taking away God little by little, already then. So it is something that pushes us into the right direction. And I here think about the slap that Heidegger or Heraclitus mentions. It's more clear in Heraclitus, we need a slap to show us into a direction that is healthier, it's more sane, and it gives true stability. It gives us everything we want, and even more so. And since we've been fearing that thing for 2,500 years, the odd thing, by making it even more horrible, we were demanded to investigate it, to investigate the apeiron, the quantum mechanics, and to find it not fearful, not horrendous, instead being the place of all good things, and also the start of everything that we had. So we can stay with all we had, and we have yet more. And that is the paradox. And that is an impossibility in the first author of the article, Austin, poor chap. But it is still real. It is absolutely real. Proved by science, but also by topology. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, there is also huge evidence coming from fractality and case theory. This is the way to go, and that way is up. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. It was a pure delight.
Thank you.